before there was a Rome. Before Julius Caesar, before the legions, before a single stone of the Colosseum was laid, there was an empire that ruled this land so completely, so richly, that when Rome finally rose from beneath it, Rome didn't destroy what came before. Rome became it. This civilization gave Rome its kings, its religion, its architecture. Even the fasces, the bundled rods and axes that would one day become the symbol of Roman power, and centuries later, fascism itself, belonged to them first. And then, almost without a single dramatic battle you've ever heard of, they vanished, not conquered in one campaign, not burned in one night. Erased so slowly, so completely, that their language died in people's mouths. Their own history books disappeared from the world entirely, and today, we can only translate a fraction of what they left behind. This is the story of the Etruscans, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why losing them may be one of the greatest thefts in the history of civilization. If hidden history like this is your thing, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know which country you're watching from. It helps this channel more than you'd think. Now, let's go back 3,000 years. Here's the first strange thing about the Etruscans. Even ancient writers couldn't agree on where they came from. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, claimed the Etruscans originally sailed from Lydia, in modern-day Western Turkey, driven from their homeland by a catastrophic famine so severe that half the population had to leave by sea to survive. A dramatic, almost mythic origin story, an entire people born from disaster and forced migration. But another ancient writer, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, flatly rejected that story centuries later. He argued the Etruscans were native to Italy all along, that they'd always been there, calling themselves the Racenna, shaping the land long before anyone sailed in from anywhere. For nearly 2,000 years, that argument simply sat unresolved, an ancient mystery nobody could crack. And here's what should genuinely surprise you. Modern science has only recently started closing in on an answer. Ancient DNA studies published in the last several years suggest the Etruscans were in fact largely indigenous to Italy, genetically distinct from populations in Anatolia, despite language and cultural traits that still puzzled historians for centuries. Herodotus, it turns out, was likely telling a story shaped by trade contact and cultural exchange, not literal ancestry. But if they didn't come from Lydia, where did their language come from? Because this is the second strange thing about the Etruscans. Their language isn't Indo-European. It doesn't belong to the same family as Latin, Greek, or virtually any other language spoken around them at the time. It stands almost entirely alone, a linguistic island in the middle of the ancient Mediterranean world. We can read the Etruscan alphabet today. It's not the mystery people assume, but we still can't fully translate everything it says, because so little of their written material survived, and what did survive is often short, formulaic, funerary text, not the deep literature, philosophy, and history we know they once had. An entire civilized literate people, and we're still, right now in the 21st century, working to fully recover their own voice. By around 700 BC, the Etruscans weren't one unified kingdom the way we might imagine an empire. They were something more flexible, and in some ways more resilient. A confederation known to history as the Etruscan League, or the Dodecapoli, the 12 cities. Each city, Veii, Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Volci, Cusi, and others, governed itself with its own king or elected magistrates, its own army, its own local identity. But they were bound together by shared religion, shared language, shared festivals, and, when it mattered most, shared military interest. This wasn't a fragile arrangement. It was, for a period of roughly 4 centuries, one of the most sophisticated, wealthy, and technologically advanced power blocks in the entire Western Mediterranean, controlling critical metal resources, particularly the iron-rich island of Elba, and building extensive trade networks stretching to Greece, Carthage, and the Near East. Their engineering alone should stop you in your tracks. Etruscan cities built advanced drainage and sewer systems, cut sophisticated road networks directly through solid rock, and constructed massive arched gateways, using true architectural arches centuries before Rome would perfect and mass-produce the technique that later defined its own empire. The famous Roman arch, Etruscan engineering adopted and scaled. Their cities were wealthy enough and artistically ambitious enough to produce elaborate painted tomb chambers that survive, remarkably, to this day, giving us something almost no other ancient civilization left behind in this form. Full-color, direct visual snapshots of daily Etruscan life, feasting, music, dancing, sport. Even in some tombs, surprisingly intimate scenes of couples reclining together at banquet, painted with a warmth and informality that feels startlingly human across 3,000 years. Here's something that consistently unsettled the Greeks and later the Romans when they encountered Etruscan society up close. Etruscan women had a level of visible public freedom that neighboring cultures found almost scandalous. Greek writers recorded, with open disapproval, that Etruscan women attended banquets alongside men, reclining at the same tables, drinking wine openly, watching athletic games in public, and appearing in society with an independence that Greek women, largely confined to the domestic sphere, simply did not share. Etruscan tomb inscriptions frequently record a woman's name alongside her mother's name, not just her father's, a detail historians still debate the full meaning of, but one that at minimum suggests female lineage carried real social weight in Etruscan identity. This wasn't universal equality by modern standards. Etruscan society still had clear class hierarchies, enslaved labor, and male-dominated political structures. But the contrast with their neighbors was stark enough that Greek writers used it almost as an insult, a sign, in their eyes, of Etruscan moral looseness. What it actually shows us is a civilization with its own distinct social values, ones we're only now learning not to view through the judgmental lens of the people who eventually replaced them. Religion sat at the absolute center of Etruscan life, and it operated through an incredibly detailed, almost technical system called the Disciplina Etrusca, a body of sacred knowledge, according to Etruscan myth revealed by a divine child named Togas, who was said to have sprung fully formed from a plowed field and taught the secrets of divination to the people before vanishing. From that foundation, Etruscan priests, called haruspices, developed an elaborate practice of reading the will of the gods through the examination of animal entrails, especially the liver, and through interpreting lightning and the flight patterns of birds. This wasn't superstition treated casually. Etruscan haruspicy became so respected across the ancient Mediterranean that centuries later, Roman generals, including some of Rome's most powerful emperors, would still call for Etruscan diviners before major military decisions, long after Etruscan political power had completely disappeared. Rome absorbed the empire but kept calling on its priests. Now here's the part of this story that should genuinely change how you see Rome. Before Rome was Rome, before it was the empire that would one day rule from Britain to Egypt, it was a small, unremarkable settlement on the Tiber River, sitting directly on the southern edge of Etruscan territory. And for roughly a century, according to Roman tradition itself, Rome was ruled not by Romans but by Etruscan kings. The Tarquin dynasty, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, governed early Rome, and under their rule the small settlement transformed. Etruscan engineers are credited, according to Roman historical tradition, with constructing Rome's first great sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, portions of which remarkably still function today. More than 2,500 years later, they're credited with organizing Rome's first true civic and religious infrastructure, including its most enduring symbols of authority. That symbol, the fasces, was Etruscan in origin, representing magisterial power and the authority to punish. Rome adopted it wholesale. So did togas, gladiatorial combat traditions rooted in Etruscan funeral games, the practice of augury, and even, some historians argue, the basic structural blueprint of Roman civic religion itself. Rome's own foundational identity, the parts we think of as most distinctly, essentially Roman, were in significant part Etruscan inheritance. Rome didn't just neighbor this empire. Rome was, for a critical formative period, quite literally ruled by it, shaped by it, built by it. So how does a civilization this foundational, this sophisticated, this deeply embedded into the very origins of Rome, simply disappear? The unraveling didn't come from one dramatic invasion. It came from slow accumulation of pressure on multiple fronts over roughly 2 centuries. The first major blow came from the sea. In 474 BC, at the Battle of Cumae off the coast of southern Italy, the Etruscan navy suffered a catastrophic defeat against a fleet from Syracuse, the powerful Greek colony in Sicily, led by the tyrant Hieron. This wasn't a minor skirmish. It broke Etruscan naval dominance in the western Mediterranean permanently. Their ability to project power by sea, protect their trade routes, and project confidence across the region never fully recovered. At almost the same time, pressure began building from an entirely different direction. Celtic tribes migrating south from beyond the Alps, pushing into the fertile Po Valley, territory the Etruscans had expanded into and depended on. Etruscan settlements in the north began falling to Celtic incursion through the early 4th century BC, cutting off resources and squeezing Etruscan territory from above at the exact moment their sea power had collapsed below. And to the south, a smaller, hungrier, increasingly organized power was watching. Rome, the very city the Etruscans had once ruled, shaped, and armed with their own institutions, was no longer a client kingdom. It was becoming a rival. And it remembered exactly how Etruscan power worked, because it had grown up learning it from the inside. The southern Etruscan city of Veii, wealthy, powerful, one of the greatest of the 12 cities and Rome's closest Etruscan neighbor, became the flashpoint. Roman and Etruscan sources both describe a siege of extraordinary length. Nearly 10 years, according to Roman tradition, ending in 396 BC when the Roman general Marcus Furius Camillus finally took the city, reportedly by tunneling directly beneath its walls into the heart of its own temple. Veii's fall didn't end the Etruscan world in a single stroke, but it marked something unmistakable. Rome, the former subject, had become capable of destroying one of the 12 cities outright. And over the following 2 centuries, city by city, that pattern repeated. Some Etruscan cities fought and fell by force. Others, watching the pattern, negotiated terms and folded into Roman alliance systems, absorbed rather than annihilated. Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Volci, Chiusi. One after another, the great cities of the Confederation lost independent power, becoming Roman allies, then Roman subjects, then eventually simply Roman. This is the part of the Etruscan story that almost never gets the dramatic treatment it deserves, because it doesn't look like collapse the way we're used to seeing it in history. There's no single burning capital, no last stand against overwhelming odds captured in one legendary battle. Instead, an entire advanced civilization was absorbed so gradually, so administratively, so quietly, that its own people may not have fully registered, in any single generation, that their world was ending. By 90 BC, following the Social War, Etruscan communities were formally granted Roman citizenship. On paper, this reads like inclusion, a peaceful integration into a larger, successful state. But citizenship came with a cost that historians now recognize as devastating in the long run. Latin became the administrative, legal, and increasingly social language of daily life. Etruscans spoke continuously for well over 1,000 years, began dying in the mouths of the very people who had once ruled the land Rome stood on. Here's the detail that should genuinely disturb you, and it's the reason this story deserves the word shock in its title. The Roman Emperor Claudius, reigning in the 1st century AD, roughly 4 centuries after Veii fell, was fascinated by the Etruscans. He'd married into a family with Etruscan heritage, studied their history and language directly, likely while some of the last fluent speakers or scholarly records were still accessible, and wrote a comprehensive 20-volume history of the Etruscan people, called the Tyrannica. 20 full volumes, a Roman emperor's dedicated scholarly attempt to preserve the history of the people who had, in very real terms, made Rome possible. That work does not exist anymore. Not one volume, not one confirmed surviving fragment. It was lost, like so much of the ancient world's literature, in the long, uneven collapse of manuscript preservation across the centuries that followed, copied by hand, dependent on continued interest, vulnerable to fire, war, neglect, and simple time. An emperor's entire documented history of an empire that built the foundations of Rome itself is, as far as we currently know, completely gone. Which means everything we understand about the Etruscans today comes from fragments, funerary inscriptions, tomb paintings, scattered references in Greek and Roman writers who often viewed them through a lens of rivalry or moral judgment, and modern archaeology racing to fill gaps that a lost 20-volume history could have closed centuries ago. We are right now still trying to recover the full story of the civilization that quite literally built the city that conquered it. The Etruscans didn't fall to a single battle you can name the way you can name Thermopylae or the sack of Rome. They dissolved, absorbed so completely into the civilization they helped create that for most of history since, people simply stopped asking where Rome's foundations actually came from. Their arches still stand in Roman ruins across Europe. Their symbol of power still echoes disturbingly in 20th century political movements that borrowed its name. Their religious specialists were still being consulted by Roman generals centuries after Etruscan cities stopped existing as independent powers. And their language, spoken continuously for well over 1,000 years by a people sophisticated enough to engineer arched roadways and paint intimate, human portraits of their own dead, is one we are, even today, only partially able to read. That's not a footnote in history. That's an entire foundational civilization quietly written out of its own legacy. If this changed how you think about where Rome actually came from, hit like, subscribe if you're not already, and let me know in the comments. Do you think a civilization can really be said to have fallen if it never lost a final battle, just slowly disappeared into the one it built? And tell me which forgotten empire you want uncovered next.